Yes, hello, welcome to Anthro New England, where I'll be getting to educate you about the furry fandom of the British Isles, that's the United Kingdom and Ireland. Just to give a bit of info on like who I am, maybe you can tell from my accent, but yes, I am British. I was born in a town called Lampton Spa in the central England, and I currently live in Manchester. I've been in the furry fandom since around 2008. And I've been going to furry conventions for nearly 14 years. In fact, Anthro New England is not only my 35th convention, but also my very first United States furry convention. Thank you. I am also experienced in both organising Furmeets and conventions. I'm one of the organisers of the Birmingham Furmeets, as well as one of the staff members of a small furry convention called Wild North. And yeah, I've done panels relating to furry history. I've been researching the subject for over 5 years, and I even have my own book on the subject. What you do now, and I'll talk a bit about it later, but I'll just leave it right here for you to admire. But yeah, if I'm being honest, if you were to speak to any other furry from within the UK, if you ever brought up like my name, Game Popper, or just Popper for short. If they do know me, 9 times out of 10, they'll most likely recognize me for looking like this. Yeah, when I've been first sitting around here, I get a lot of comments saying, "I like your mask." So it's a thank you. Thank you very much. But yeah, let's begin our journey by going a bit back in time. So, yeah, that's a bit too far back. We don't have that much time, so I'm gonna jump ahead a bit. No. Oh God, no. Right, there we go. Perfect. So I'm gonna give a very brief description of like the US American furry fandom at this point. I definitely recommend a book by Joe Strike called Furry Nation if you want a more detailed US furry history. But for the sake of this panel, so furries were finally starting to get its footing in the realm of fandoms in the mid-80s. By this point, they had moved away from the funny animal genre that had been used to describe comics and cartoons featuring human-like animals, using the name furry fans to describe themselves, and using the term anthropomorphics to describe the works that fascinated them, particularly to make it sound more mature. So in the United States, you had early fans like Mark Molina and Rod O'Reilly hosting room parties at various science fiction and comic book conventions around California, and Ray Rooney around Philadelphia. You have Steve Galacci and Stan Sakai and several comic book writers and artists that were finding success producing anthropomorphic comics, either targeted in anthologies or standalones. Fans had plenty of opportunities to correspond with each other through letters and fanzines, particularly after Raoul Brazel began in 1983. There were early signs of an international presence with documented evidence of correspondence with fans in Australia, like the furry novelist Paulie Kidd at the time. So speaking of, it was inevitable that the furry fandom would find its way to Britain. For starters, Britain and the United States have had a long history between them when it came to science fiction, going back to the late 1920s. It wasn't uncommon for American fans to write to British fans and fanzines, and vice versa, and there were a fair few fans who would make the transatlantic trip. Take Ian Curtis, for example, who is this guy on the right. He was a huge fan of science fiction, comics, and wargaming, and worked as a writer and correspondent for the military press. This gave him the ability to travel to the United States for work and stay a while to attend conventions where he would meet with American fans, and he gained an interest from the furry fandom through that. The UK also had a long history with comics, including indie or small press comics. There was even a particular moment in comic book history known as the British Invasion, where British writers started getting attention in the States in the late 1980s. That's why you have Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman are big names. They rose to fame through this British invasion. Meanwhile, anthropomorphic comics and anthologies would be imported by comic retailers alongside the Marvels and the DCs. This was the avenue for a few early British fans like Simon Barber. He discovered the fandom when he found a copy of Albeit Anthropomorphics in a comic book shop in Oxford, a year after he finished creating a Musketeer-themed anthropomorphic comic called the Furtannians, this one right here. Although it is also worth pointing out that these people did show signs of having an interest in furry long before discovering it by their own admission. So these two in particular, they were fans of a classic British comic strip called Rupert the Bear. That was a very long-running newspapers and in annuals, and even had their own fan clubs. Ian Curtis in particular was also a fan of Bonzo the Dog, who was a popular cartoon dog from the 1920s. That's kind of the British equivalent of Felix the Cat. And even Simon Barber, he wrote the foreword for my book, and he even admitted that his first furry story was a fanfic he wrote back in 1918 based on the novel Wind in the Willows. You definitely had to have a particular interest, even way back in the 80s, to get into the furry fandom. Then you have the case of American furry fancy travels to the UK. So if you're familiar with furry history, you know Mark Molino, along with being the co-founder of the Cartoon Fantasy organization, and he was a member of VUTI. He would host room parties at various sci-fi conventions. In 1987, the World Science Fiction Convention was taking place in Brighton, which is south of England, and Mark was an attender with his partner and his friends. He put out an announcement on the convention's letter and created this flyer right here to promote a furry party that they were running at a hotel that was down the road from the convention's main venue. They had around 20 people attend, most of whom were new to the idea of furry but warmed up to the idea, checking out comics as well as some rare anime on a 7-inch portable TV. All in all, it was a good exposure to the fandom, and it's possible some continued to write to each other afterwards. According to Rod O'Reilly, there was even a British furry who traveled to California in 1989 to attend ConFuzzled, which is the first furry convention in the world. So the next huge development in the UK furry scene happened in early 1992, when a group of American furry fans and comic artists were planning to attend an international comics festival in France. As part of the trip, they all planned to stop over in England for a few days, and this is where Ian Curtis comes back in. After receiving this news from a comic artist named Monica Livingstone, he invited an American guest to come to his home for a Housecon in Yateley, which is down in Surrey, and at the same time invite some British fans to meet them. The International Comics Festival was largely seen as a bad experience by the Americans, predominantly because they were there to sell comics, sell their artwork, and the French comic book fans, they weren't entirely interested. It had something to do with the format of the comics. American comics were traditionally sold on paperback, but the French comic book artists, they preferred hardback trade comics. But the experience itself was mostly eased by the fact that Simon Barber just happened to be at that comics festival at the time. Just hung around, socialized with them, showed them where the best places to eat were. But then the Americans went to England, and that was a much more pleasant experience. A few American furries visited a furry fan who was living up in Scotland. A few did some sightseeing in London, while the rest went down to Yateley to meet with the British fans, including Curtis. Some of the British fans travelled as far as Manchester and Wales just to check out these American artists and comics, so it was a good experience to be had. So the success of the first Yateley Housecon kicks off the British furry fandom to be self-sustaining. While Mark Molino and Rod O'Reilly did travel to Glasgow in Scotland for a few American furries to host a room party in 1995 World Science Fiction Convention, where they got to be both English and Scottish furry fans. British furries were running their own gatherings like the Yateley Housecons, as well as the UK Furcon, which began in Colchester before moving to Bristol and then having a more permanent home in the city of Coventry. At their peak, these Housecons would have had up to 30 people spending a weekend together at someone's house, including guests from Europe, Australia, and North America, with activities like sketching comic books, watching cartoons, reading latest fanzines issues, taking trips to the photocopier to photocopy the fanzine pages, and hanging out at the computer labs. So speaking of, when we go to internet, so bulletin board systems and multi-user dungeons existed as early forms of the internet in the 1980s, but they were slow and largely inaccessible unless you worked for a big company or a university. It definitely wasn't as capable for communicating across countries as it is nowadays, but in the UK, internet picked up largely thanks to a man named Cliff Stanford when he created a company called Demon Internet. He basically paved the way for dial-up internet in the UK, and it was from that more British furries were able to get access to stuff like Furry Muck and alt-fan furry Usenet boards. But also in the 90s, we also actually set up our own fanzines. The most noteworthy one from the 90s was called Anthropomorphine by Foxley, or Lazy Fox Studios. We also had UK furry publishers like United Publications, who are pretty noteworthy for publishing some of Paulie Kidd's famous works. And now we move forward to the Furmeets. So we now go on to 1998. Number of furries grew, so the demands to meet up. This was a time where more furry conventions were popping up around the United States and even parts of Europe and Australia, but also not everyone could travel and fit in with the Housecons, so why not just create your own meetups? A group of students at Hertfordshire University started one-off gatherings in London, typically hanging out around the Soho district, parks like St James's Park, and local pubs like the Intrepid Fox. Although, disclaimer, Intrepid Fox is named after a British politician named Charles James Fox. It's not named after the animal. Although you might be interested in Charles James Fox because he actually supported the American Revolution. So these London gatherings would be established as a regular Furmeet around May or June 1999 as the London Furs, setting up their own website and their own mailing list for correspondence. Even in their beginnings, where they had like very small numbers, they actually struggled to find a pub or venue with enough space to accommodate them. So for the first few years, they actually had to move around to several different venues. But as you can see in these photos, fursuits weren't as prominent or the quality as they are nowadays. So most furries were either students or working class backgrounds. They couldn't exactly afford a handmade bespoke fursuit from America. And the knowledge around how to make fursuits was fairly limited. I've seen most historical discussions give credit to a book called Critical Costuming that was published in 2004 for giving detailed guides on how fursuits can be made. YouTube also definitely helped in the mid-2000s, but this is still 1999. So what ended up happening, in none of us in particular, was that your best options were either hire out a mascot costume from a costume shop, or you do face painting. Also around this time, there were gatherings who had more niche interests, particularly those of the furrian variety. So furries nowadays is treated more as an umbrella term for anyone who is either a fan of furry-related media or those who are identified in some spiritual form of being an animal or somewhere in between them. But in the 90s, they were very separated terms. You had furry fans and you had lifestyle furries. London Furs was a unique event in that it was advertised as being all-inclusive. The 80 Housecons were targeted to be more furry fan-related, but you also had furry lifestyle-themed events like Brit Howl, Euro Howl, and UK Furrians that took place in cities like Oxford and Portsmouth, but they were geared towards those kinds of people. So, start of the millennium, furries in Hampshire and the northern regions started to set up their own groups as local furries could talk to each other and meet up in those areas without having to travel all the way down to London. Northern Furs in particular had pushed to organising regular monthly meetups beginning in the city of Chester. The Outwinds, the mailing list, then organised Furmeets in the cities of Manchester and Liverpool, which went well amongst the group, but it caused a bit of a problem when the next week came and people wanted a Furmeet in this city or that city. They don't want another Furmeet in Chester again or Manchester again. The admins basically then settled this by saying, okay, instead we're going to have Furmeets in these 6 cities, but we're going to go on a rotational system, a rota. So 1 month is this city, then this city, then this city, then this city. They had 6 cities, so essentially each city had a Furmeet twice a year, once every 6 months. But this did effectively stop the debate, stop the arguing, because people then said okay, so now I know that the Furmeet is going to be happening at this city on this month, I can save up money and plan for this trip, and I could maybe pass out on this one because it's a little bit too far away from me. People like this idea so much that you had other regional groups having their own rota system. So For instance, there's the mid-furs. They initially started by having Furmeets decided by vote, but then they choose to having a rotational system where it would be around 3 cities, Birmingham, Nottingham, and Leicester. But then over the next 4 years, more regions began forming, and largely thanks to web forums. So in like the 2000s and 2010s, we had the UK Fur Forums. That was our central discussion hub at the time. But we also had like IRC chat rooms where you could have like the UK first chat, and then you could have sub chats for different regions. And that eventually helped get people to organize their own regional groups, their own Furmeets. Some chose to have the rotational system, like Scotland. They have their own rota system between 3 cities. For others, you would just meet up in like their biggest city. So Welsh Furs would be Cardiff, Northern Ireland Furs would be Belfast, for example. And this was kind of how the Furmeets worked up until like the 2010s, when basically there were enough demand for Furmeets in local cities to have monthly Furmeets in those cities instead, which a lot of them are running to this day. But this growth had an interesting effect that it's probably best to just visually show you. So this is the state of Massachusetts, and all the markers you see, those are regular monthly Furmeets that are at least found just by searching online. Yeah, like you got 5 in like in some of your biggest cities. But just as another example, so this is California. California is roughly the same size as the UK. It has like half the population of the UK. Still has 5 or 6 Furmeets, most of them in the main city regions. Now here's the UK. Yeah, the few times I've spoken to American furs just visiting Britain, they are surprised at the number of Furmeets in this country. So what this means is that if you ever travel to the UK and Ireland, there's a good chance that you can go to any city and socialize with some local furries at a Furmeet. Bring a fursuit with you and you can take part in the local fursuit walk. Since most Furmeets have a bar or restaurant as the main venues, and because of drinking laws, most Furmeets are 16 plus. So if you're under the age of 16, it's worth getting in touch with the Furmeet organizers ahead of time to see if it is possible to participate. Because even if you can't go into the bar, you can still like hang around the fursuit walk with like parental supervision. But yeah, as you can see, we have a Furmeet in each capital city, each with their own websites and social media channels to find out when they will next take place, and you can plan ahead. London Furs is the oldest active Furmeet, unique in that it takes place once every 3 weeks, and is of course the largest. Almost always with around like 150 people in attendance per Furmeet. Edinburgh and Belfast are constantly on Saturdays, while Cardiff has their Furmeets on a Sunday. Irish furries, I couldn't find like a very fixed routine, but their social media channels is always like put out a detailed schedule, like when they're having like meetups in either Dublin or Cork County. But yeah, they aren't the only ones. It's worth visiting one of our nation's other cities and their Furmeet. You can meet more people, visit more unique sites, and you can save money, especially if you know how expensive London can be. So, for instance, Lincoln is just northeast of London. They're unique in that they move around their venues and activities. So they'll do like bowling, they'll do nature walks, they'll have a barbecue in the summer. Sheffield Furs will also do like a pub quiz that's very nerdy based. Put on my local, which is Mank Furs, and Birmingham Furs, which is one I've been organising for several years. Good friends with a lot of people there. Just an example. Right, now we get on to British furry conventions. So this is more of a story of a struggle. And it all has to begin with a furry convention in Germany called Eurofurence. So for those who don't know, Eurofurence began in 1995 as a Housecon, inspired by those that were taking place in the UK, specifically UK FurCon. As I was one that was attended by 2 German furries who ran the first Eurofurence at the family home vacation farmhouse in Kaiserwilhelmskrug, which is north of Germany. So there was a verbal agreement that went about between the Eurofurence organizers and attendees, so that the convention would be open to proposals for where it should take place each year, some within the European continent. So when the plans were taking place for Eurofurence 4 in 1997, One of the founders named Unki suggested the UK as a potential location and reached out to the UK Fur's mailing list for suggestions. At least 2 venues were found by the UK furries that met the requirements, but a nagging point that's being rejected was cost of travel and accommodation. It didn't help that Eurofurence took place in the summer, which is peak holiday season for the UK. A lot of accommodation, prices rise. Eurofurence 4 would also take place in the Netherlands that year. But you can't blame UK furries for being persistent. They tried proposing UK as a Eurofurence location all the way up to like 2003, all the times being shot down because of cost as the main reason. Repeated rejections had their toll, as the furries decided that if they weren't going to have Eurofurence in the UK should just organise a convention of their own. As you can see from the bullet points, if you don't recognise the names of any of these, it's because they were all promoted at some point, but they were all cancelled. This was due to a variety of reasons, from difficulty securing a venue, personal reasons, online drama, financial issues. Although one key factor is that people who are involved didn't have that much experience or know-how in running a large event. The newest cancelled conventions soon demoralised the UK furry scene to a point where the phrase British Furry Convention was a running joke of a thing that was never going to happen. But if we move forward, yes, they actually did happen. Yay! So, in 2008, this actually happened twice. First was ConFuzzled, and then there's also RBW. So, ConFuzzled was the brainchild of a Northern Fur organizer named Furball Fox. In 2003, he fell out with the Brit Fur organizers and began talking with his friends about running a convention of their own, based on their own experience of running Northern Furmeets. Furball Fox then kicked off planning by getting a team together during Eurofurence in 2005. He got a bunch of convention chairpersons as consultants and secured the Youth Hostel Association Manchester in 2007. It officially ran in June 2008 with 136 people in attendance. Fun fact is that out of the attendance figure, there were reports that nearly 50% of them were fursuiters. Yeah, AfroCon and Furry Confusion had a ratio of around like 5 to 10% of attendees around the time. Granted, they were much bigger conventions, but let's just ignore that fact. Meanwhile, 2006, the lead organizer of London Furmeets at the time was named Repeater Frog. He was organising the party to take place during the Winter Furmeet in December. He decided on the idea of hiring a party boat that would sail all the way down the River Thames, and people would enjoy music, drinks, and some comedy, naming the RBW after red, blue, and white, the colours of the flag. It was a sold-out event of 85 tickets, so he decided to repeat it the following year on a bigger party boat, making a deal with a hotel. Also, furries had somewhere to sleep once the party was over, which proved another success. Repeater Frog would later step down partway through 2008, but his team followed through with growing RBW from an overnight party to a 4-day convention in November 2008 with 290 people. Funny enough, because these two conventions were running in the same year, there was a heated debate going on about whether these conventions were competing against each other, and both of them had to make a joint statement to say that they're not trying to compete each other, we're actually collaborating to make some good events for the country. Yeah, unfortunately, RBW only lasted for 3 years. After 2008, the attendance figures dropped in 2009 and didn't really change in 2010s, despite the many improvements they tried to make. But London Fairs does keep the spirit of RBW alive with a boat party in both July and December for their summer and winter weekenders. Right, so if you want to check out some more bigger UK or Ireland furry events, here's a rundown of the furry conventions from oldest to newest. It's worth keeping in mind that all these furry conventions in the UK, as well as most of Europe, are 18 plus. So let's begin with ConFuzzled, which still runs to this day and is the largest furry convention in the UK. At one point it was the 10th largest furry convention in the world. I believe it's now like 15. It's 15. Thank you. Its home since 2014 has been the Hilton Metropole Hotel, located in Resorts World Birmingham, which, like Disneyland theme park, claims to be based in a massive city when really it's just located just outside in a lesser-known area. Luckily for you international guests, it's right next to the Birmingham Airport and Birmingham International Railway Station. and there are several hotels nearby. If you can't get to the main hotel or the overflow. The mascot is Brock the Badger. He's the one on the left with the top hat. Very recently, he has joined named by his newest friends Mel, the honey badger, and Dern the crocodile. All of them fursuited, so you can see them walking around the convention. This convention is definitely recommended if you're a fan of like very busy conventions where like you have lots of events. So next on the list is ScotiaCon, which you can tell by the name is a very Scottish furry convention. It's started in 2011 in the most northern city of Scotland called Inverness, which yes is close to Loch Ness. Its mascot is a Scottish Terrier named Wallace, of the Braveheart's William Wallace fame. And you can take our lives but not take our freedom. The original events of early ScotiaCon were all about like Scottish culture in some way. So you had like fursuit games that involved like caber tossing, sorts. You had like Eat Scotland, where you eat like Scottish delicacies. This convention has been growing like by around 100 attendees per year, rather consistently, and it's had to move frankly a bit more closer south. So right now it takes place at the Crown Plaza in Glasgow, which is next to the Scottish Event Campus, which fortunately has a good international connection. I think there is a Glasgow International Airport. Right, next one. So yeah, okay, I will explain this a bit later, but disclaimer, I started work on this platform just before I went to vacation last year. After RBW ended, ConFuzzled and ScotiaCon were like the only real options for furry conventions in the UK for a couple of years. It was a particular problem with ConFuzzled because some considered it was getting too big, and this was back when there was only over 1,000 attendees. So there was like a push for more smaller conventions. And around the early 2010s, we ended up getting Free. But for brevity's sake, I'm only going to focus on Furcation because that was the only one that was still running as of last year. So Furcation is what I would describe as the least convention-like convention. Its founder, Jasper Fox, had previously run a successful furry dance event in the Bristol area called Frantic Euphoria, and initially wanted to do a weekend music festival based on ones he liked to attend. After Frantic Euphoria closed, him and his friends modified that idea and decided to set up a furry event based on a classic British holiday destination, a holiday park by the coast. So how it works is that instead of a hotel, you stayed in a chalet or a caravan. And while there was a central events hall for events, furries could either do activities outdoor or even visit the beach if they wanted to. Its mascot has two friends, Frankie and Clyde. It expanded thanks largely being very low priced and a very relaxed environment, with its main home being the John Fowler's Sandy Glade Hardy Park in Burnham-on-Sea in Devon. That's southwest England here. So yeah, last November it moved to a much larger holiday park in Dorset, but there were a bunch of bad actors who made a mess of the park, meaning that it's currently on hiatus until a new venue can be secured. Honestly, it's a shame because like I said, I went to Furcation. I had a really nice time. The only real downside was the storm that basically made it impossible to do anything outdoors. Well, it's all for the best. Thanks for the reminder. So back in early 2018, I was at a London Furmeet with two friends of mine. And two friends of mine said, hey, we're having a weekend at a bunkhouse up north. Do you want to join them? I said, sure. So I drove up nearly 4 hours to Northumberland. There were 12 of us having a really nice time at this bunkhouse. And then on the last day, one of those friends, his name's Silverley, he along with his partner Tyler and another friend named Kivu, hope you enjoyed this year's Wild North. Next year, we're going to have a full convention in a bigger place. And the bigger place was a 13th century castle. Yeah, so despite its size, Wild North stands out amongst British furry cons. So along with its medieval venue, is that it was a self-catering con. So breakfast, lunch and dinners were all made by furries for furries, and I know very well that experience because I was part of the kitchen team for the last 3 years. But also, we do love to go all out on the medieval theming. We have sword fighting workshops, as fantasy stories of like quests involving the convention's mascot Twizzle, the red squirrel, as well as ghost hunting. Because of the venue's size, attendance had to be capped to 60 people. This year, Waldorf is moving to a 14th century castle, where the castle is increased to 100. So fingers crossed that we can get a few more people to come and join the medieval experience. So after the COVID-19 pandemic, which forced all of our Furmeets and conventions to go virtual, we ended up getting a whole new generation of furries and new conventions as well. So Anthro Irish debuted in 2023 as the Republic of Ireland's first furry convention, with Rebel Fox as their mascot. It returned last year with double the attendance and has already been confirmed for 2025. I'm aware Cork County is a bit of a distance from Dublin, but I also know that Boston International Airport has like a direct flight to Dublin. So anyone local to this state, it's probably a convention worth checking out. Last year in August, the Welsh furry community had their convention debut with AberCon. I'm not sure why they went with the name despite calling in Paul Talbot instead of like Aberystwyth. Maybe the convention wanted to make a hardline stance on the Moors or Paws debate. Aber means river mouth. Anyway, it's currently a small 2-day convention, but it's also bilingual, so all the text are in both Welsh and English. So now, if only someone can get a furry convention going in Northern Ireland, I can one day say that every nation of the British Isles has a furry convention, but hey, free out of thought. Lastly, we have our youngest furry convention, called Pawsome, which took place in Gloucester last October. It might be hard to tell, but this convention sets itself apart because it has a more liberal dress code. Basically, like how this convention has 18 plus events, this convention is almost all 18 plus. Yeah, that they allow clothing attire that this convention allows, as well as clothing attire suitable for adults after dark. As such, convention with additional emphasis on being 18 plus, but on the other hand, you'll find this is to be a convention that's more liberating along with a small con vibe. That being said, this is the largest debut of a furry convention since RBW back in 2008, and it looks like they plan to be back in October this year. And now we're back to today. So the UK does have other events outside of the Furmeets conventions. We have had a history of furry nightclubs dating back to 2008 with the likes of Frantic Euphoria. Manchester, we have Club Animals, which has been running since 2017 with roughly around 4 or 5 events per year. Recently expanded to hosting a late night dance event at ConFuzzled and Pawsome, as well as Germany with Animals Berlin. We used to have an annual camping event called Festival that ran from 2011 to 2023, from the vast northern beauty that we call the Peak Districts, as well as like a southern-based event called South Fur Camp, but sadly there's no more. But recently there has been a growing move towards more chill weekend cabin events. So the photo on the right is of a cabin con, which takes place up in Scarborough. There's also another one that takes place in the Peak District called Per Peaks that was only began this year. Still very small and fairly exclusive events, but it'd probably be worth keeping an eye on them. They might grow. So when I talk about the furry fandom where I'm from, I try to get across is that one, furries have been around outside the US a lot longer than you think. And two, is that the furry fandom is more than just London or ConFuzzled. Like, yes, they are large and a lot of British furries go to them, but there is a community across the countries. There are Furmeets, conventions, parties, and even opportunities to hang out in a chalet or a cabin. This year is the first time I've ever attended a furry event in the United States, and I've had a great time. But I've also met several American furries who have traveled to Britain, and they've always been impressed by the abundance of Furmeets and close-knit events. If you ever decide to visit my country, there will be furries who will want to meet you. And yeah, that's all I had to talk about. If you want a more detailed history of the UK furry fandom, I wrote this book. It was published back in 2023, but it's got all the history and goes into detail about the furry conventions, Furmeets and whatnot. I've got a QR code that'll take you to the publisher where you can buy it directly. As well as this is a community-made Furmeet map for all of the events that you can find across both the UK and Ireland. It has all the Furmeets and conventions, as well as like other small events there as well. But yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you.